The late afternoon sun filtered through the sheer curtains of Sarah Martinez's childhood home in suburban Phoenix, Arizona, casting warm, golden streaks across the living room, where pink and blue balloons bobbed gently near the ceiling. The desert heat outside was unforgiving even in early October, but inside, the air conditioning hummed steadily, keeping the house at a comfortable temperature for the 30 guests who had gathered to celebrate what should have been one of the happiest days of Sarah's life. At 24, Sarah had always imagined her baby shower differently. She'd pictured herself glowing with that pregnancy radiance everyone talked about, her belly round and proud, surrounded by friends and family who shared in her joy. Instead, she stood in the corner of her mother's meticulously decorated living room, her hand unconsciously resting on her still flat stomach where their 8-week-old secret was growing. Her long, dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and despite her mother's insistence that she wear the flowing lavender dress they'd picked out together, she felt exposed and vulnerable. "Mija, you look beautiful," her mother, Elena, whispered as she approached with a plate of homemade empanadas. Elena Martinez was a woman who believed that food could solve most problems, and today she'd outdone herself with a spread that would feed twice as many people. Her weathered hands, marked by years of working as a school cafeteria manager, gently squeezed Sarah's arm. "Are you feeling okay? You've been so quiet." Sarah forced a smile, the same smile she'd been wearing for the past 2 weeks since she and Jake had decided to have this celebration early, before she was really showing. It had been Jake's idea, actually. "Let's get it over with while you can still hide it," he'd said, his words carrying a weight that Sarah had tried to ignore at the time. "I'm fine, Mom. Just a little nervous, you know?" Sarah's voice was steady, but Elena's maternal instincts picked up on the tension her daughter was carrying in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing toward the front door as if she were planning an escape route. The living room buzzed with conversation in both English and Spanish, a familiar symphony in the Martinez household. Sarah's extended family had driven in from across the valley, her tia Rosa from Glendale, her prima Carmen from Tempe, and even her abuela from South Phoenix, despite the old woman's complaints about the traffic. Mixed in with family were Sarah's closest friends, her college roommate Jessica, her work friends from the accounting firm where she'd been steadily climbing the corporate ladder, and neighbors who had watched her grow up in this same house. Jake stood near the kitchen island, a beer in his hand despite it being barely past 4 in the afternoon. At 26, he cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of confident posture that had first attracted Sarah when they'd met at a mutual friend's barbecue 2 years ago. His sandy brown hair was perfectly styled, and he wore the kind of casual but expensive clothes that suggested success without trying too hard. But today, something was different about his demeanor. His jaw was tense. His blue eyes held a coldness that Sarah had been seeing more frequently lately, and he was drinking faster than usual. "So, Jake, when's the wedding?" asked Sarah's Tio Miguel, a man who believed in traditional timelines and wasn't shy about expressing his opinions. He was standing with a group of Sarah's male relatives, all of whom were giving Jake the kind of scrutinizing looks that came naturally to protective family members. Jake's grip tightened on his beer bottle. "We're taking things one step at a time," he replied, his voice carrying an edge that made Sarah's stomach clench with anxiety from across the room. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself gravitating toward her friend Jessica, a petite blonde who had been her anchor through college and remained her closest confidant. Jessica was examining the gift table with the trained eye of someone who had attended more baby showers than she cared to count. "This is a beautiful setup," Jessica said, gesturing toward the elaborate decorations Elena had spent weeks planning. "Your mom really went all out. And look at all these gifts. People are so generous." Sarah nodded, but her attention kept drifting to Jake, who was now engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly uncomfortable conversation with her father, Roberto. Roberto Martinez was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. He'd worked construction for 30 years before starting his own small contracting business, and his hands showed the evidence of decades of hard labor. He was the kind of father who showed love through actions rather than words, and Sarah could see the concern in his dark eyes as he studied Jake's body language. "You know, mijo," Roberto was saying, his accent thick with the authority of someone who had earned his right to speak plainly, "having a baby, it changes everything. Changes your priorities, your responsibilities, makes you grow up real quick." Jake's response was barely audible from where Sarah stood, but she could see his face reddening, whether from embarrassment, anger, or the effects of his third beer. She wasn't sure. The afternoon progressed with the typical baby shower activities, games that made everyone laugh, the opening of gifts that drew collective awes from the crowd, and the sharing of advice from the experienced mothers in the group. Sarah's abuela, a tiny woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen nearly 8 decades of life, held court from her chair in the corner. "La vida is not always easy, mija," she told Sarah during a quiet moment between activities. "But los niños, they bring such joy, such purpose, you'll see." Her weathered hand patted Sarah's knee with surprising strength. "And you have familia. We help each other, see." But as the sun began to set outside and the party reached its peak energy, an undercurrent of tension was building. Sarah noticed Jake's increasingly frequent trips to the kitchen, ostensibly to help but really to access the cooler where he'd stashed more beer. She noticed the way conversations seemed to quiet slightly when he joined them, the way her male relatives were exchanging glances that spoke of growing concern. The moment that would change everything came during what should have been the highlight of the evening, the toast. Elena had prepared a beautiful speech about new beginnings and the blessing of grandchildren, and she stood in the center of the living room with a glass of sparkling cider raised high. "To Sarah and Jake," she began, her voice warm with maternal pride, "and to the precious little one who will make us all grandparents, tios and tias. May this baby be surrounded by love and..." "Love?" Jake's voice cut through Eleanor's toast like a blade through silk. The room fell silent so suddenly that the only sound was the distant hum of the air conditioning. He stood near the kitchen island, swaying slightly, his beer bottle now empty in his hand. "You want to talk about love?" Sarah felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. She could see it in his eyes. The anger, the resentment, the words that were about to spill out and shatter everything. "Jake, please," she started, but he was already speaking, his voice loud enough to ensure every person in that room would hear him clearly. "She trapped me," he announced, his words slicing through the shocked silence like shards of broken glass. "Plain and simple, she trapped me with this pregnancy." The silence that followed was deafening. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward Sarah, who stood frozen in place, her face burning with humiliation as the words settled over the room like a toxic cloud. Her mother's glass of cider slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering on the tile floor in a burst of amber liquid and crystal fragments. Eleanor's face went through a series of emotions in rapid succession: confusion, understanding, and then a fury that made her petite frame seem suddenly formidable. "¿Qué dijiste?" she demanded, her voice low and dangerous. But Jake wasn't finished. The alcohol had loosened his tongue and dissolved whatever filter might have remained. "I mean, look at her," he continued, gesturing toward Sarah with his empty bottle. "Not even showing yet, and we're having a baby shower? This whole thing is it's all about trapping me into marriage, into playing house, into..." "Get out." Roberto's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. He stood slowly from his chair, his full height and breadth becoming apparent as he fixed Jake with a stare that had made grown men reconsider their life choices. "Get out of my house. Now." Jake seemed to realize, perhaps for the first time, the magnitude of what he had just done. He looked around the room at the faces staring back at him, some angry, some shocked, some filled with pity. But it was Sarah's face that seemed to finally penetrate the alcohol-induced haze. She stood exactly where she had been when he'd started speaking, her dark eyes wide with shock and pain, her face pale except for the bright red flush of humiliation that colored her cheeks. "Sarah, I didn't mean," he started, but the damage was done, and everyone in that room knew it. "Yes, you did." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the room, every word carried clearly. "You meant every word." Jake looked around once more, perhaps hoping for some ally, some face that didn't reflect disappointment or disgust. Finding none, he set his empty bottle on the counter with more force than necessary, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Fine," he said, his voice now carrying a defensive edge. "Fine. This is exactly why I didn't want to do this in the first place." He grabbed his keys from the bowl by the front door, his movements sharp and angry. "Call me when you're ready to have an actual conversation instead of this circus." The front door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the family photos hanging in the hallway. The sound seemed to break the spell that had held everyone frozen, and suddenly the room erupted in a cacophony of voices, angry Spanish from the older relatives, concerned English from Sarah's friends, and the sound of Elena crying as she knelt to clean up the broken glass from her shattered cider glass. Sarah remained standing in the same spot, her hand still resting protectively on her stomach as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. In the space of 2 minutes, her relationship, her pregnancy announcement, and her sense of security had all been shattered as completely as the glass at her mother's feet. Jessica was the first to reach her, wrapping her arms around Sarah's shoulders as the first tears began to fall. "Sweetie, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." But Sarah wasn't crying yet. She was still in shock, still processing the fact that the man she had loved, the man she had been planning a future with, had just publicly humiliated her in front of everyone she cared about most. The man who was supposed to be her partner had just announced to her entire family that she was a manipulator, a trap setter, someone who had gotten pregnant on purpose to ensnare him. As the evening wound down early and guests began to make their awkward departures, offering hugs and whispered words of support, Sarah found herself sitting on the couch, surrounded by the open baby gifts, tiny clothes, soft blankets, stuffed animals, and all the hopeful accessories of a future that now felt uncertain and precarious. Eleanor sat beside her daughter, her arm around Sarah's shoulders as they both stared at the evidence of a celebration that had turned into a catastrophe. "Mija," Elena said softly, "that man, he showed you who he really is today, and when someone shows you who they are, you believe them." Outside, the desert night was settling over Phoenix, the temperature finally beginning to drop as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Inside the Martinez home, a young woman was beginning to understand that her life had just taken a dramatic turn, and that the road ahead would require strength she wasn't sure she possessed. But as she sat surrounded by the love of her family and the gifts from people who cared about her and her unborn child, Sarah began to realize something important. She wasn't as alone as Jake had made her feel. The trap he had accused her of setting was really a trap he had set for himself, a trap of his own cowardice, his own inability to take responsibility for the choices that had led them both to this moment. The morning after the baby shower dawned grey and overcast, unusual for Phoenix in October. Sarah woke in her childhood bedroom, a space that had remained largely unchanged since her high school graduation 6 years ago. The walls still held faded posters of bands she'd loved as a teenager, and her old desk was cluttered with the same trophies and academic awards that had once made her parents so proud. But lying there in her twin bed, staring at the ceiling she'd memorized during countless sleepless nights of adolescent anxiety, she felt like a completely different person than the confident young woman who had left this room to build her adult life. Her phone had been buzzing intermittently since dawn, a constant reminder of the humiliation from the night before. Text messages, missed calls, voicemails, all evidence that word was spreading about what Jake had done. Sarah had turned the phone face down hours ago, unable to bear seeing his name appear on the screen, alongside the concerned messages from friends and family. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Mija, I brought you some coffee." Eleanor's voice was gentler than usual, carrying the careful tone of someone walking on eggshells around a wounded animal. "Come in, Mom." Sarah pulled herself up against the headboard, accepting the steaming mug her mother offered. The coffee was prepared exactly the way Sarah had liked it since college, a splash of cream and just enough sugar to take the edge off. It was such a small gesture, but in her current emotional state, it felt like an act of profound love. Elena settled on the edge of the bed, her own mug cradled in her hands. She had been up late cleaning the remnants of the party, but she looked alert and determined, as if she had spent the night formulating a plan of action. "How are you feeling this morning, physically, I mean?" "Nauseous," Sarah admitted, taking a careful sip of coffee, "but I think that's more from stress than morning sickness." She paused, studying her mother's face. "Mom, I need you to know. What Jake said last night, it wasn't true. I didn't trap him. We were both... it was an accident, but it wasn't some scheme." Eleanor's expression softened with relief. "Mija, I know you. I raised you. I know the kind of person you are, and I know you would never do something like that." She reached over to smooth Sarah's tangled hair away from her face. "But even if this baby was planned, that man had no right to humiliate you like that. No right at all." The sound of the front door opening and closing drifted up from downstairs, followed by the familiar cadence of Roberto's footsteps in the kitchen. Eleanor glanced toward the door. "Your father went to get breakfast from that place you like, Maria's Kitchen. He thought you might want some of their chilaquiles." Sarah's stomach rumbled despite her emotional turmoil. She hadn't eaten much at the party, too nervous to do more than pick at the elaborate spread her mother had prepared. "That sounds good, actually." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been haunting her since she'd woken up. Has Jake called? Or come by?" Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Your father may have made it very clear to him that he's not welcome here right now. At least not until he's ready to have a serious conversation about how he's going to make this right." Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed again on the nightstand. This time she couldn't ignore it. Jessica's name appeared on the screen with an incoming call. Sarah took a deep breath and answered. "Hey, Jess. Honey, how are you holding up?" Jessica's voice was warm but concerned. "I've been worried about you all night. I tried calling earlier, but I figured you might need some space. I don't know how I am, honestly." Sarah found herself close to tears again, the simple act of hearing her friend's voice breaking down some of the walls she'd built up overnight. "I keep replaying it in my head, wondering if there were signs I missed, or if I could have prevented it somehow." "Sarah, stop!" Jessica's voice was firm. "What happened last night was not your fault. Jake made a choice to humiliate you in front of your family, and that choice says everything about who he is and nothing about who you are." Eleanor nodded approvingly from her perch on the bed, clearly eavesdropping, but not caring about the pretense of privacy. "I know that intellectually," Sarah said, "but emotionally, God, Jess, the way everyone looked at me, the way the whole room just went silent. I've never been so embarrassed in my entire life. I can imagine. But Sarah, I want you to think about what happened after Jake left. Think about how your family rallied around you. Think about how many people stayed to help clean up, to make sure you were okay. Think about your grandmother. She pulled me aside before she left and said, 'That boy, he did my granddaughter a favor. Better to know now than after the wedding.'" Sarah couldn't help but smile slightly at that. Her abuela had never been one to mince words, and she had a point. She really said that? She did, and she's right, As horrible as last night was, at least now you know exactly where you stand with Jake. No more wondering, no more hoping he'll step up. He showed you who he really is. After hanging up with Jessica, Sarah finally felt ready to face the day. She showered, letting the hot water wash away some of the lingering humiliation from the night before, and dressed in comfortable clothes, jeans and one of her father's old work shirts that she'd claimed years ago and never returned. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled like home, coffee, cinnamon, and the distinctive aroma of Maria's Kitchen chilaquiles. Roberto was sitting at the kitchen table with his own breakfast, reading the news on his tablet with the focused attention he gave to everything in his life. "Morning, Mija," he said without looking up. But Sarah could hear the carefully controlled emotion in his voice. Roberto had never been comfortable with big emotional displays, but his anger from the night before had been unmistakable. "Morning, Dad." Sarah settled into her usual chair, accepting the plate Elena set in front of her. The chilaquiles were perfect. Crispy tortilla chips smothered in red sauce, topped with eggs, cheese, and a dollop of sour cream. Comfort food at its finest. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Roberto finally set down his tablet and looked directly at his daughter. "Sarah, I want you to know that what that boy did last night, that's not how a man acts. A real man takes responsibility for his actions. A real man protects the woman he loves, especially when she's carrying his child." Sarah nodded, focusing on her food to avoid the tears that were threatening again. "Your mother and we've been talking," Roberto continued, "and we want you to know that you have options. You can stay here as long as you need to. You can raise this baby here with our help. Or if you want to get your own place, we'll help with that too. Whatever you need, Mija. Family takes care of family." The relief Sarah felt at hearing these words was overwhelming. She had been so afraid that her parents might be disappointed in her, might see her pregnancy as a mistake or a failure. Instead, they were offering unconditional support. "Thank you," she managed to say around the lump in her throat. "Both of you. I don't know what I would do without you." Elena reached across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand. "You'll never have to find out." The rest of the morning was spent in practical planning. Sarah called in sick to work, knowing she wasn't emotionally ready to face her colleagues and their inevitable questions. Elena cancelled her own plans for the day, declaring that her daughter needed her more than the church committee needed help with their fundraiser planning. Around noon, as Sarah was helping her mother organize the baby gifts from the night before, the doorbell rang. Roberto answered it, and Sarah could hear a familiar voice in the entryway, Carmen, her cousin, who had driven over from Tempe. Carmen appeared in the living room carrying a large bag from Target and wearing the kind of determined expression that Sarah remembered from their childhood when Carmen had decided to take on the neighborhood bullies. "Prima," Carmen said, setting down her bag and enveloping Sarah in a fierce hug. "I came as soon as I could get away from work. How are you doing?" At 28, Carmen was 4 years older than Sarah and had always been more like a sister than a cousin. She had 2 children of her own and had been through her own relationship struggles, including a messy divorce 2 years earlier. "I've been better," Sarah admitted, "but I'm glad you're here." Carmen settled onto the couch, pulling items out of her Target bag. "Good, because I brought reinforcements. Ice cream, chocolate, those face masks you like, and..." She held up a bottle of sparkling cider. "Alcohol-free champagne, because we're going to toast to your future. Your better future, without that pendejo." Elena raised an eyebrow at the language, but Carmen was undeterred. "What? He is a pendejo, a big one, and Sarah is better off without him." "Carmen's right," Elena agreed, settling into her recliner, "though maybe we could use more appropriate language." "Fine, he's a jerk," Carmen amended, making Sarah laugh for the first time since the disaster began. As the afternoon progressed, more family members began to arrive. Tia Rosa came with homemade tamales, insisting that Sarah needed to eat for the baby. Uncle Miguel arrived with his wife and teenage daughter, offering to help with anything that needed doing. Even Sarah's elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, stopped by with a casserole and words of encouragement. The house began to feel like a sanctuary, filled with people who loved Sarah unconditionally and were ready to support her through whatever came next. But underneath the warmth and love, there was an undercurrent of anger, not at Sarah, but at Jake for his cowardice and cruelty. It was Carmen who finally brought up the elephant in the room. "So what's the plan with Jake? Are you going to try to work things out, or are you done with him?" Sarah had been dreading this question, partly because she wasn't sure she knew the answer. "I honestly don't know," she admitted. part of me thinks I should at least try to talk to him for the baby's sake, but another part of me never wants to see him again. What does your gut tell you? Asked Tia Rosa, who had always been the family's unofficial advisor on matters of the heart. Sarah thought about it, really considered the question. My gut tells me that the way he acted last night, that's who he really is. When things got real, when he was faced with actual responsibility, he lashed out and tried to make me the villain. She paused, her hand moving unconsciously to her stomach. I don't want my child to grow up thinking that's what love looks like. Roberto nodded approvingly from his chair in the corner. That's my smart daughter talking. And as evening approached and the family gathering began to wind down, Sarah found herself feeling stronger than she had since the disaster began. The love and support of her family had reminded her of something important. She was not alone, and she was not powerless. After everyone had gone home and the house had returned to its usual quiet, Sarah sat in the living room with her parents, finally ready to address the practical realities of her situation. I think I need to move back home, she said quietly. At least for a while. My lease is up at the end of the month anyway, and with everything that's happened, I think I need to be around family right now. Elena's face lit up with relief and joy. Of course, Mija. Your room is exactly as you left it. We can start moving your things whenever you're ready. And work? Roberto asked. Are you going to tell them about the baby? I have to, eventually. But I think I need a few more days to figure out how I want to handle everything. Sarah leaned back against the couch cushions, feeling the weight of the last 24 hours settling on her shoulders. I keep thinking about what Jake said, about trapping him. And I know it's not true, but I can't shake the feeling that everyone must be wondering if it is. Anyone who knows you would never think that, Eleanor said firmly. And anyone who doesn't know you well enough to understand your character, their opinion doesn't matter. As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. She was going to delete Jake's number from her phone. Not permanently, he was still the father of her child, and they would need to communicate eventually. But for now, she needed space to heal and to figure out who she was going to be as a single mother. Before turning off the light, she placed her hand on her still flat stomach and whispered the first words she had spoken directly to her unborn child. It's going to be okay, baby. We're going to be okay. We have so many people who love us already, and we're going to build a good life together. I promise. 3 weeks had passed since the baby shower disaster, and Sarah was beginning to establish a new rhythm to her life. The Phoenix autumn was settling in with its characteristic beauty, warm days that no longer felt oppressive, cool evenings perfect for sitting on the back patio, and the kind of clear skies that reminded natives why they endured the brutal summers. Sarah had moved back into her childhood home completely now, her adult life condensed into boxes that lined one wall of her old bedroom. The transition had been both comforting and disorienting. Comforting to be surrounded by family and the familiar rhythms of the Martinez household, disorienting to feel like she was moving backward in life just when she should have been moving forward. Her morning routine had evolved to accommodate both her pregnancy symptoms and her emotional healing. She woke early before the nausea typically hit and spent quiet time on the back patio with her coffee and a prenatal vitamin that had become as essential as breathing. The morning solitude gave her space to think, to process, and to slowly build the confidence she would need for the day ahead. This particular morning, as she sat watching the sunrise paint the desert mountains in shades of pink and gold, her phone rang. The caller ID showed her supervisor's name, Margaret Chen, a woman in her 50s who had become something of a mentor during Sarah's 3 years at Pinnacle Accounting. Good morning, Margaret, Sarah answered, trying to inject more energy into her voice than she actually felt. Sarah, how are you feeling? Are you ready to come back to work? Margaret's voice carried the professional warmth that had made her such an effective manager. I know you've been dealing with some personal issues and I don't want to pressure you, but we're heading into busy season and I wanted to check in. Sarah had been dreading this conversation while simultaneously knowing it was inevitable. Actually, Margaret, I was hoping we could talk today, in person if possible. There are some things I need to discuss with you about my situation. Of course. Why don't you come in around 10? We can talk in my office privately. After hanging up, Sarah felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. She had been putting off the conversation about her pregnancy partly because she wasn't sure how her employer would react, and partly because speaking it aloud to her professional colleagues would make it feel more real, more permanent. Elena emerged from the house, carrying her own coffee mug, settling into the chair beside her daughter with the easy companionship that had developed between them over the past few weeks. "Work calling?" Elena asked, having overheard the end of the conversation. "Yeah, I think it's time to tell them about the baby." Sarah turned to face her mother. "I'm nervous, Mom. What if they think I'm unreliable? What if they start treating me differently?" Elena considered this carefully before responding. "Mia, you've been with that company for 3 years. You've gotten 2 promotions, and they've always spoken highly of your work. If they're the kind of people who would treat you poorly because you're having a baby, then they're not the kind of people you want to work for anyway." Sarah knew her mother was right, but the fear lingered. In the weeks since Jake's betrayal, she had become acutely aware of how much her life was changing and how much she would need to rely on herself. Her job wasn't just a career anymore, it was her lifeline, her pathway to independence and security for herself and her child. 2 hours later, Sarah sat in Margaret's office, a space that managed to be both professional and warm. Margaret was a petite woman with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She had built her career in a male-dominated field and had always been an advocate for the younger women in the company. "So," Margaret said, settling behind her desk with a cup of tea, "what did you want to discuss?" Sarah had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, but now that the moment had arrived, her carefully planned words seemed to evaporate. "I'm pregnant," she said simply, "about 12 weeks along now." Margaret's face immediately brightened. "Sarah, that's wonderful news. Congratulations." But then she seemed to notice Sarah's lack of enthusiasm, and her expression grew more cautious. "Is everything all right? You don't seem particularly happy about it." "It's complicated," Sarah admitted. "The father and we're not together anymore. It's going to be just me." She paused, then added quickly, "But I want you to know that this won't affect my work. I'm committed to my job, and I'm not planning to take any unnecessary time off." Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with the perceptive gaze that made her such an effective manager. "Sarah, I appreciate your dedication, but let's talk realistically about what this means. You're going to need prenatal appointments. You may have morning sickness that affects your schedule, and eventually you'll need maternity leave." "I know, and I'll make up any time I need to take off. I can work extra hours, Margaret held up a hand to stop her. "Sarah, slow down. First of all, you don't need to apologize for being pregnant. Second, this company has policies in place specifically to support employees in your situation. We want to work with you, not against you." The relief Sarah felt was overwhelming. She had been so afraid of being seen as a burden or a liability that she hadn't considered the possibility that her employer might actually be supportive. "What I'd like to do," Margaret continued, "is set up a meeting with HR to go over your options. We have excellent maternity leave policies, and we've had several employees successfully balance pregnancy and their careers. There's no reason you can't do the same." As Sarah left the office building an hour later, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. Not only had Margaret been supportive, but she had also offered Sarah the opportunity to take on a new project, creating accounting systems for small businesses that could potentially be done partially from home after the baby was born. Her phone buzzed with a text from Carmen. "How did the work thing go? And don't forget, doctor's appointment at 2. I'm picking you up at 1:30. Sarah had scheduled her first official prenatal appointment for that afternoon, and Carmen had insisted on coming along for moral support. It would be the first time Sarah would see her baby on an ultrasound, and she was both excited and terrified. Carmen arrived at exactly 1:30 as promised, driving her reliable Honda Civic with 2 car seats in the back, reminders of her own journey through single motherhood. "Ready for this?" Carmen asked as they pulled into the parking lot of the medical complex. "I think so," Sarah replied. "It's weird. I've known I was pregnant for over a month now, but it still doesn't feel completely real." "Trust me, it'll feel real today," Carmen said with a knowing smile. Dr. Patricia Reyes turned out to be exactly the kind of healthcare provider Sarah had hoped for, warm, knowledgeable, and completely matter-of-fact about Sarah's situation as a single mother-to-be. She was a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes, and the sort of calm competence that immediately put Sarah at ease. "Everything looks excellent," Dr. Reyes announced after completing the initial examination. "Your blood pressure is good. Your weight gain is right on track, and all your lab results are normal. Are you ready to see your baby?" Sarah nodded, her throat suddenly tight with emotion. Carmen squeezed her hand as Dr. Reyes prepared the ultrasound equipment. The room fell silent except for the hum of the machine as Dr. Reyes moved the wand across Sarah's abdomen. Then, suddenly, there it was, a grainy black and white image on the screen that somehow unmistakably showed a tiny human form. "There's your baby," Dr. Reyes announced, pointing to the screen. "And there's the heartbeat." The sound that filled the room was rapid and strong. Lub-dub, 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 the unmistakable rhythm of new life. Sarah stared at the screen in amazement, watching her child move and shift, completely unaware of the complicated world waiting outside the safety of the womb. Carmen was crying openly now, and Sarah realized that tears were streaming down her own face as well. But these weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of recognition, of love, of the profound realization that she was no longer just responsible for herself. "Would you like some pictures?" Dr. Reyes asked, already reaching for the printer. "Yes, please," Sarah managed to say around the lump in her throat. As they drove home from the appointment, Sarah clutched the ultrasound photos in her hands, studying the grainy images of her child. Carmen glanced over at her periodically, smiling at the wonder on her cousin's face. "So, how do you feel now?" Carmen asked. "Different?" "Completely different," Sarah admitted. "I mean, I knew I was pregnant before, but seeing the baby, hearing the heartbeat, it makes it real in a way that nothing else could." Carmen nodded knowingly. "I remember that feeling. It's like someone flips a switch inside you, and suddenly you understand what people mean when they talk about maternal instinct." When they arrived home, Eleanor was waiting anxiously in the living room, clearly eager to hear about the appointment. Her face lit up when she saw the ultrasound photos Sarah was carrying. "¿Cómo está mi nieto?" Eleanor asked, using the masculine form, but quickly correcting herself. "O nieta. How is my grandchild?" "Perfect," Sarah said, settling onto the couch beside her mother and spreading the photos on the coffee table. Dr. Reyes said, "Everything looks exactly as it should. The baby is measuring right on schedule, and the heartbeat is strong." Elena picked up one of the photos, holding it carefully as if it were made of spun glass. "Look at that little profile," she whispered. "Already so beautiful." Roberto emerged from his workshop in the garage, his hands still dusty from whatever project he'd been working on. He washed them carefully at the kitchen sink before joining the women in the living room, accepting one of the ultrasound photos with the same reverence Elena had shown. "Strong-looking baby," he pronounced after studying the image. "Good bone structure." Sarah couldn't help but laugh. "Dad, you can't tell bone structure from an ultrasound photo." "I can tell," Roberto insisted with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong about anything important in his life. "This baby is going to be healthy and strong." That evening, as the family sat around the dinner table sharing Elena's homemade pozole, Sarah felt a sense of contentment that had been missing from her life for weeks. The conversation flowed easily between English and Spanish, touching on everything from Roberto's latest contracting job to Elena's plans for the church's upcoming festival. "I've been thinking," Sarah said during a lull in the conversation, "about names. If it's a girl, I'd like to name her Sofia after Abuela. And if it's a boy, she paused, glancing at her father. Maybe Roberto after Dad. Roberto's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth, and for a moment he looked genuinely surprised. Mija, you don't have to. I want to, Sarah interrupted. You've both been so incredible through all of this. This baby is going to be lucky to have you as grandparents, and I want them to carry family names. Elena reached across the table to squeeze Sarah's hand, her eyes bright with tears. Abuela would be so honored, she whispered. After dinner, Sarah retreated to her room to call Jessica and share the news about the appointment. Her friend answered on the first ring as if she'd been waiting by the phone. So, how did it go? Tell me everything. Sarah found herself smiling as she recounted the day's events, the supportive conversation with Margaret, the amazing ultrasound experience, the family's reaction to the photos. As she talked, she realized something important. For the first time since the baby shower disaster, she was talking about her pregnancy with genuine excitement and joy, rather than fear and anxiety. You sound different, Jessica observed. Happier, more settled. I feel different, Sarah admitted. Seeing the baby today, it changed something for me. This isn't just something that happened to me anymore. It's my child, my family, my future, and I'm starting to believe that maybe that future can be really good. What about Jake? Jessica asked carefully. Have you heard from him at all? Sarah's mood dimmed slightly at the mention of his name. No, and honestly, I'm glad. I'm not ready to deal with him yet. Doctor, Reyes said I need to focus on staying stress-free and healthy, and Jake is the opposite of stress-free. That makes sense. But eventually, I'll have to figure out what role he's going to play in this baby's life, if any, Sarah finished. But that's a problem for future Sarah. Present Sarah is just focusing on being healthy and building a good life for me and the baby. After hanging up with Jessica, Sarah spread the ultrasound photos on her old desk and studied them again. In the grainy black and white images, she could see the outline of a tiny head, the curve of a spine, the suggestion of arms and legs. This little person was growing inside her, completely dependent on her for everything, and the responsibility was both terrifying and exhilarating. She picked up a pen and began writing in the journal Dr. Reyes had recommended for tracking her pregnancy thoughts and experiences. Today, I saw you for the first time, little one. I heard your heartbeat and watched you move around like you were dancing just for me. I know your daddy isn't in the picture right now, and I don't know what that's going to mean for our future, but I want you to know that you are already so loved. Abuela Elena is already planning to spoil you rotten, and Abuelo Roberto is building you a crib in his workshop, even though you won't need it for months. Tia Carmen says you're going to be best friends with your cousins, and she's probably right. I was scared when I first found out about you, scared about how I was going to handle everything alone, but I'm starting to realize that I'm not alone, not even close. We have a whole family ready to love and support us, and we're going to be okay. More than okay. We're going to be happy. As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she found herself planning for the future in a way she hadn't been able to do since the baby shower. She thought about converting the small guest room into a nursery, about the baby clothes she would need to buy, about the conversation she would have with her child as they grew up. She also thought about Jake and the conversation they would eventually need to have, but for the first time, she approached that thought without fear or desperation. If he wanted to be part of their child's life, he would need to prove that he was capable of being a positive presence. If he didn't, then she and the baby would be fine without him. The last thing Sarah did before turning off the light was to place one of the ultrasound photos on her nightstand, where she could see it first thing in the morning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new steps forward in her journey toward single motherhood. But tonight, she fell asleep feeling strong, supported, and genuinely excited about the future she was building for herself and her child. Outside her window, the desert night settled over Phoenix, with its characteristic stillness, and somewhere in the darkness, new life continued to grow, nurtured by love and strengthened by the determination of a young woman who was discovering reserves of courage she never knew she possessed. The Phoenix summer was just beginning to release its grip on the city when Sarah Martinez walked across the stage at Phoenix Children's Hospital to receive her certificate in pediatric accounting systems, a specialized training program she had completed during her pregnancy. At 32 weeks pregnant, she moved carefully but confidently, her hand resting protectively on her rounded belly as she accepted the recognition for her innovative work on streamlining financial processes for healthcare providers. 6 months had passed since the baby shower disaster that had initially shattered her world, and Sarah could hardly recognize the scared, humiliated woman she had been that terrible October evening. The woman accepting the certificate was confident, independent, and genuinely excited about her future. In the audience, Elena dabbed at her eyes with a tissue while Roberto beamed with pride, his large hands clapping enthusiastically despite his usual reserved demeanor. Carmen sat beside them with her 2 children, who were coloring in programs and occasionally whispering loud questions about when the baby would arrive. "Tia Sarah looks really big," Carmen's 8-year-old daughter, Isabella, announced in a stage whisper that carried several rows. "Shh, mija." Carmen hushed her, but she was smiling. "That's not polite to say about pregnant ladies." "But when is the baby coming?" 6-year-old Diego persisted. "Soon," Elena whispered back. "Very soon." After the ceremony, the family gathered in the parking lot for photos, everyone wanting to capture this moment of triumph. Sarah stood in the center, glowing with more than just pregnancy radiance. She was glowing with accomplishment and self-assurance. "I'm so proud of you, mija," Elena said, carefully embracing her daughter around her substantial belly. "Look at everything you've achieved while growing our grandchild." And it was true. The past 6 months had been a period of unprecedented growth for Sarah, both personally and professionally. After the initial shock and grief of Jake's betrayal had begun to fade, she had thrown herself into rebuilding her life with a determination that surprised everyone, including herself. The specialized certification she had just received was only the latest in a series of professional achievements. Her innovative work on the accounting systems project at Pinnacle had caught the attention of several major healthcare providers, and she had been offered a position as a consultant that would allow her to work partially from home after the baby arrived. "I have something to tell you all," Sarah announced as they stood in the hospital parking lot, her eyes bright with excitement. "I got the call yesterday, but I wanted to wait until after the ceremony to share the news. Phoenix Children's Hospital offered me a permanent position as their Director of Financial Operations. It comes with an amazing benefits package, flexible scheduling, and on-site childcare." The family erupted in congratulations, everyone talking at once in a mixture of English and Spanish. Roberto pulled his daughter into a careful hug, his voice gruff with emotion. "That's my smart daughter," he said. "I always knew you were destined for big things." As they drove home from the ceremony, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The past 6 months hadn't been easy. There had been difficult days, moments of doubt, and the ongoing challenge of preparing for single motherhood while building her career. But there had also been unexpected joys, new friendships, and the growing confidence that came from proving to herself that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. The baby shower gifts that had once seemed like painful reminders of her humiliation had been transformed into practical preparations for her daughter's arrival. Yes, a daughter. Sofia Elena Martinez, as she would be named, combining the memory of her great-grandmother with the honor of the woman who had shown Sarah what true strength looked like. Dr. Reyes had confirmed the baby's gender during the 20-week ultrasound, and Sarah had felt a surge of fierce protectiveness as she looked at the image of her little girl on the screen. She was determined that Sophia would grow up knowing her own worth, surrounded by people who respected and valued her, never doubting that she deserved to be treated with love and dignity. That evening, as the family celebrated Sarah's achievement with a dinner at her favorite Mexican restaurant, the conversation naturally turned to the approaching birth and the final preparations that needed to be made. "The nursery is almost finished," Roberto announced with pride. "Just need to install the mobile and hang the pictures." Over the past month, Roberto had transformed the small guest room into a perfect nursery, complete with a handcrafted crib that would become a family heirloom. Elena had sewn curtains and organized baby clothes with the efficiency of a woman who had been waiting 30 years to become a grandmother. "And I've been thinking about childcare," Elena added. "I know you have the option at the hospital, but I was hoping maybe I could watch Sophia sometimes. I've been talking to Mrs. Rodriguez next door, and she's been caring for her granddaughter while her daughter works. Maybe we could do something together, help each other out." Sarah reached across the table to squeeze her mother's hand. "Mom, I would love that. Sophia is going to be so lucky to have you as her abuela." As they were finishing dessert, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it absently, then froze as she recognized the name on the screen. "Jake, can we talk? I know I don't deserve it, but there are things I need to say before the baby comes." The message felt like a cold wind blowing through the warm restaurant, bringing with it memories of hurt and humiliation that Sarah had worked so hard to overcome. Elena noticed her daughter's sudden change in demeanor immediately. "What is it, Mija? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah showed her the message, watching as her mother's expression hardened. Roberto leaned over to read it as well, his jaw tightening in the way it did when he was suppressing strong emotion. "What do you want to do?" Elena asked carefully. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, considering her options. For months, she had been dreading this moment, the inevitable contact from Jake, the conversations they would need to have about their daughter's future. She had played out various scenarios in her mind, imagining everything from hostile confrontations to tearful reconciliations. But sitting here in the restaurant, surrounded by the family who had supported her through everything, feeling her daughter moving actively in her womb, Sarah realized that she no longer feared Jake or the power she had once given him to hurt her. "I think," she said slowly, "that I need to talk to him. Not because I owe him anything, but because Sophia deserves to know that I tried to give her the opportunity to have a relationship with her father, if that's what he really wants." Carmen leaned forward, her expression serious. "Are you sure you're ready for that? Because once you open that door—" "I'm ready," Sarah said, and she meant it. "I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago. I know who I am now. I know what I'm worth, and I know what I will and won't accept. If Jake wants to be part of Sophia's life, he's going to have to prove that he's changed. And if he hasn't," she shrugged, "then Sophia and I will be fine without him." Roberto nodded approvingly. "That's the right attitude, Mija, but you don't have to do this alone. Whatever you decide, we're here." 2 days later, Sarah sat in a coffee shop in downtown Phoenix, her hands wrapped around a decaf latte as she waited for Jake to arrive. She had chosen this location deliberately, public enough to feel safe, but quiet enough for a serious conversation. She wore a flowing blue dress that flattered her pregnant figure and made her feel confident and beautiful. When Jake walked through the door, Sarah barely recognized him. He had lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. His usually perfect hair looked disheveled, and his clothes, while clean, lacked their usual careful coordination. He spotted her immediately and made his way over, his steps hesitant and uncertain. "Sarah," he said softly as he approached the table, "thank you for agreeing to see me. You look amazing." "Thank you," Sarah replied evenly, gesturing for him to sit across from her. "You wanted to talk, so talk." Jake settled into his chair, his hands fidgeting with a napkin as he struggled to find the words. "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness," he began. "What I did at the baby shower was unforgivable. I was drunk and scared, and I took it out on you in the worst possible way. Sarah watched him carefully, listening not just to his words, but to the tone behind them, the body language that would tell her whether this apology was genuine or just another manipulation. "I've been going to therapy," Jake continued. "AA meetings too. I realized that night that I had a problem, not just with drinking, but with taking responsibility for my actions, with being the kind of man I thought I was versus the kind of man I actually was." "And what kind of man are you, Jake?" Sarah asked quietly. He looked directly at her for the first time since sitting down. "Honestly, I'm still figuring that out, but I know I'm not the man who humiliated you in front of your family. I know I'm not the man who blamed you for something that was equally my responsibility, and I know I want to be the kind of man who can be a good father to our daughter." The mention of their daughter made Sarah's hand move instinctively to her belly, where Sophia was currently practicing what felt like soccer kicks against her ribs. "How do you know it's a girl?" Sarah asked. "Your cousin Carmen may have mentioned it on social media," Jake admitted. I've been following your life from a distance, trying to work up the courage to reach out. I know about the job, the certification, all the amazing things you've accomplished. I'm proud of you, Sarah. And I'm ashamed that I almost derailed it all." Sarah considered his words carefully. There was something different about Jake, a humility that hadn't been there before, a willingness to acknowledge his failures that was new. But she had learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts were telling her to proceed with extreme caution. "If you want to be part of Sophia's life," she said finally, "you're going to have to prove that you've really changed. Not just with words, but with actions. Consistent actions over time." "I understand," Jake said quickly. "I don't expect you to trust me right away. I know I have to earn it. What exactly are you asking for?" Sarah wanted to be clear about his expectations and her boundaries. Jake took a deep breath. "I'd like the chance to be Sophia's father, not necessarily to get back together with you. I understand that I destroyed that possibility, but I want to be involved in her life, to support her, to be someone she can count on." Sarah studied his face, looking for any sign of the anger or entitlement that had characterized their final interactions. She didn't see it, but she also knew that people could change their behavior temporarily when they wanted something. "Here's what I'm willing to offer," she said after a long pause. "After Sophia is born, if you're still sober and still in therapy, we can discuss supervised visitation. You'll need to prove that you're stable and reliable over a period of months before I'll consider any kind of regular custody arrangement." "That's fair," Jake said, and he seemed to mean it. "More than fair, considering everything." "And Jake," Sarah added, her voice carrying the steel that had developed over the past 6 months, "if you ever speak to me or about me the way you did that night, if you ever try to manipulate or control me, if you give me any reason to believe that you're not prioritizing Sophia's well-being over your own wants, you're out permanently. Do you understand?" "I understand," Jake said solemnly. "And Sarah, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything I put you through. You deserved so much better than what I gave you." As they parted ways outside the coffee shop, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was closure in finally having the conversation she had been dreading, but there was also wariness about what the future might hold. Jake seemed genuinely remorseful, but Sarah had learned that apologies were easy. Changed behavior was what mattered. That evening, as she recounted the conversation to her family, she could see the skepticism in their faces. "I hope he's really changed, Mija," Elena said carefully, "but I also hope you're prepared for the possibility that he hasn't." "I am," Sarah assured her. "I went into that conversation with very clear boundaries, and I'll maintain those boundaries no matter what. Sophia's safety and well-being are my only priorities." Roberto nodded approvingly. "You handled it exactly right. Give him the chance to prove himself, but don't make it easy for him." 2 weeks later, Sarah went into labor on a Tuesday morning while she was reviewing financial reports for her new position. The contractions started gradually, building in intensity until Eleanor insisted on driving her to the hospital, despite Sarah's protests that it was too early. 12 hours later, Sofia Elena Martinez made her entrance into the world at 6:47 p.m., weighing 7 pounds 2 ounces and announcing her arrival with a cry that could be heard down the hallway. She was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and a full head of dark hair that she had clearly inherited from her mother. As Dr. Reyes placed the baby on Sarah's chest for the first time, Sarah felt a love so intense and immediate that it took her breath away. This tiny person, warm and slippery and absolutely beautiful, was hers. They had made this journey together, and they would continue making it together, supported by a family that already adored her. "Hola, mi amor," Sarah whispered to her daughter. "I'm your mama and I love you so much." Elena and Roberta were among the first visitors, both of them crying openly as they met their granddaughter. Carmen arrived shortly after with flowers and the promise that Isabella and Diego were beside themselves with excitement to meet their new cousin. Jake sent a text message asking about the baby, and Sarah responded with a simple, "Sofia Elena Martinez, born today at 6:47 p.m. Mother and baby are both healthy." She included a single photo, Sofia sleeping peacefully in her arms. His response came quickly. "She's beautiful. Thank you for letting me know. Take care of yourself." As Sarah settled in for her first night as a mother, Sofia sleeping peacefully in the bassinet beside her hospital bed, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she never could have imagined that her life would take this path. From a relationship she had thought was leading toward marriage, through the devastation of public humiliation, to this moment of pure joy and accomplishment. She had learned that she was stronger than she had ever known, that family was the foundation that could support any dream, and that sometimes what looked like the end of everything was actually the beginning of something far better. Looking at her sleeping daughter, Sarah whispered the same promise she had made 6 months earlier, but with a confidence born of experience. "We're going to be okay, mi amor. More than okay. We're going to be extraordinary." Outside the hospital window, the lights of Phoenix twinkled in the desert darkness, a city full of possibilities and new beginnings. Somewhere in that vast landscape, a young woman was starting the greatest adventure of her life, not as the victim of someone else's cruelty, but as the architect of her own happiness, the author of her own story, and the mother of a little girl who would grow up knowing that she was wanted, loved, and valued beyond measure. The story ended not with a fairy tale rescue or a romantic reconciliation, but with something far more powerful. A woman who had rescued herself, built her own castle, and created a kingdom of love and possibility for herself and her daughter. It was a beginning disguised as an ending, the first page of a story that would be written one day, one choice, one moment of courage at a time.